In the early 1900s, the Soviets tried to abolish all forms of money. It's hard to imagine a modern industrialized country operating without money. However, the Soviets tried to do just that immediately after taking power in Russia. In today's video, I want to try to explain the rationale behind this Soviet strategy and the insane impact it had on the Russian economy. By the way, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. History Meets Finance is growing slowly but surely. We just hit 1,000 subscribers and our goal is to hit 2,000 by the end of this year, and your support will mean a lot. Okay, let's get back to the video. Before we discuss a moneyless society, it's first important to understand why the Soviets were keen on implementing something like this in the first place. As you know, the Soviets were inspired by the philosophy of Karl Marx. According to him, money reduced all human endeavors to mere commodities. In other words, the logic of money dictated relationships, knowledge, friendships, and so on, and it made it such that individuals themselves had no inherent value. Rather, their value was judged externally in terms of money, and because of this alienating aspect of money, Karl Marx saw it as the root of all evil. He thought that the very existence of money itself was the problem. And because money was the root of all evil, the Soviets saw that eliminating it was the first steps towards establishing their communist utopia. In its place, there would be a centrally planned economy. One where people would be expected to work according to their abilities and they would be given the resources according to their needs. It sounds like a good idea, but there were challenges. In fact, there was a problem, a pretty massive one, hindering their ambitious goal. And that was that the country was in shambles. There were more than 3.3 million Russians who died in World War I. Moreover, the Tsarist government had relied excessively on printing paper money to cover its war expenses. And then immediately afterwards, following the Soviet takeover, the country plunged into a civil war. This led to even more deaths and more disruptions in the economy. Inflation was rampant, people were going hungry, supply chains were disrupted, industries were being shut down because they had no oil or coal to run on. And to top that off, some of Russia's most productive industrial and agricultural land was being occupied by the Axis powers. So overall, it wasn't a great time to be living there. So taking all of that into account, it would have been logical to fix these underlying problems before making any big reforms, right? But the Soviets decided to go another way. They decided to go ahead with their policy of abolishing money anyway. They were going to drag the Russian society into a moneyless society no matter what. Amongst the first steps that they took in their bid to abolish money was taking full control over the money supply, and they did this by taking control of the banks. And so the Russian banks were forcefully seized and dissembled. Their reserves and incomes were redirected instead to the government, which means a state monopoly on banking was afoot. Any prior debt held by the state was also declared cancelled, which was very convenient, by the way. So doing all this creates a problem. The Soviets started seeing even bigger challenges. They needed financing to run the state nationalized industries and to continue their ongoing civil war. However, now there was no one there to lend them money. And so they started raising taxes by a lot, and they started collecting this tax as quickly as possible. But even that wasn't enough to fill the gaps in the government budget. That's when they started printing even more money to cover their expenses. And this ended up being the only available source of funds that could tackle the country's expenses. So let's take stock of things right now. There's a massive and rising money supply, there's an economy in recession, and all of that leads to hyperinflation. At the end of 1918, inflation measured at 598%, and the following year it rose to 1376%. See, this was a big problem. The currency was now almost worthless, and so farmers had no incentive to produce anything more than their own needs. This in turn started creating a food shortage. Cities were now running out of food. The Soviets resorted to taking food forcefully from the farmers to supply cities. But the problem is, food cannot be grown on short notice. So the farmers, now devoid of food for themselves, were suffering a severe famine. The farming sector was weakened, and it led to even further food shortages. You see, the situation would just become so dire that in many places, human meat was being sold in several places, including that of children. It was a really, horrific time. So it's not surprising that the idea of abolishing money backfired significantly. You see, the Soviets had imagined that by making money worthless, they would annihilate the power of the wealthy money hoarders. And this in turn would allow equal distribution of resources and less hostilities in society. But instead, it resulted in people doubling down and hoarding whatever resources that they could. Even government bodies and entire cities were competing against each other. The state has ceased to function effectively as a unit. By 1920, the Soviets had won the Civil War, and now they redirected their effort into the new economic war. At first, they doubled down on their effort to eliminate money. It's a bit ridiculous, but it involved printing even more money because they wanted to pay for essential things like medicine and food. However, this only worsened the crisis. Inflation now hit a record 1,614%. People had enough, and they were beginning to revolt. In the end, the Soviet government finally realized that their war communism had gone too far. War communism was what they called their project to eradicate money. And so they reversed course. They started issuing a gold-backed currency, and they made the central bank independent again and rebalanced the budget. And this yielded some positive results. From 1923 onwards, things finally started to normalize. Well, that was until a certain man with a mustache came into power. But that's a story for another time. You see, the Soviets aimed to rid the Russians of the great evil of money, but their attempt resulted in uncountable tragedies with millions dying. This is a perfect reminder that ideals are simply that, ideals. Reality works differently. Rather than making rapid reforms with little oversight about how they would play out, it's better to make slow, incremental changes, giving time for ordinary people to adapt to the change. If you like this video about Soviets abolishing money, I think you'll enjoy this video about how the Incan Empire functioned without money as well. Check it out here and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next week.